Every year there are always a couple of guys who go undrafted that end up making a final 53-man roster. The best story this year comes from a player by the name of Carson Steele. Going back in time, Carson Steele was a two-star recruit who was pretty much an afterthought from every major program. While people saw he had talent, he struggled with injuries and many people thought he would never be able to make it. He ended up going to Ball State, where he became one of the best running backs in school history, transferred to UCLA for one season, and was still not good enough to be picked by any NFL franchise. Just like always though, the Kansas City Chiefs have an eye for talent, and they decided to grab Carson Steele. He ended up playing both fullback and running back this preseason, and Carson Steele impressed so much that he ended up making that 53-man roster and could be the next secret gem for the Kansas City Chiefs. In today's video, I want to talk about the impossible story of Carson Steele. How did he go from a two-star recruit with no future to a guy who's now one of the more popular players in NFL media? That's what I'm going to tell you today, but before we get started, if you're a big fan of football, the season is now here, so quickly be sure to take a quick moment to subscribe, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about the insane rise of Carson Steele. In order to understand how Steele got to this point, we first need to go back in time. Growing up in Greenwood, Indiana, the Steele family was always tough and unique. One interesting story was that Carson had wanted an animal for Christmas. The elementary school kid thought he'd get a lizard or maybe some sort of bearded dragon, but his father instead decided to give him a dwarf alligator. He would order that off the internet from a gator farm in Florida, and that thing would be with him for the remainder of his childhood and actually helped him go viral at the NFL Combine a couple months ago. As a boy, he lost one battle with that pet alligator, as it's now 5.5 feet long back in Indiana, as he was forged by a childhood spent pushing cars and running hills wearing a weighted vest. When Carson was 8 years old, his father had him push a car around the neighborhood to simulate the motion of a running back driving his body. Joseph had heard of that exercise from an uncle who told a story about Indianapolis Colts players who were doing that years earlier. Carson said, quote, "I mean, it is a little ludicrous or maybe even off the wall, but once it starts rolling, it's not actually as hard as people think it is." It certainly was confusing for neighbors to watch through their windows as a young boy strained against a car in the dark with its emergency lights on. Sometimes people would go outside to see what was going on, but it ended up paying off for Carson. He was built tough. A few years later, a local high school football coach looked in similar disbelief as he saw the kid wearing a weighted vest going up the hill. The coach said, quote, "How old is that kid? I don't even have my high schoolers doing that." Eventually, Center Grove's head coach saw the talent that Steele possessed in middle school as he was quick and strong, but he figured players on the team at Center Grove would be able to slow him down once he got to high school. They were wrong. Once he got to Center Grove, he ended up making a name for himself. In his first varsity game, Moore remembers him going for 60 yards against a very tough Warren Central team. Originally, he was supposed to be stuck on the JV team, but he got bumped up to varsity because the other backs were fumbling the ball, and Steele finished with 132 yards and 2 touchdowns. Another fun fact is while I was at Carmel High School in 2017, Carson Steele actually put up a couple hundred yards on our defense, which at the time was near at the top of the state. So I actually knew about Carson Steele 3 years before I even started doing YouTube, which is kind of crazy. Early on in Steele's career, Moore told him, quote, "If you really want to be in shape when you play football, you have to run to the end zone and score every time." Apparently he took that literally, as every rep he got, he literally ran to the end zone during practice. That would eventually translate to the field, as there were huge expectations going into his junior season at Center Grove. His first 2 years, he had racked up nearly 4,000 yards and 49 rushing touchdowns and was a bona fide star. Unfortunately though, he ended up pulling a hamstring in his right leg, and that kept him from starting the season opener against Warren. He ended up watching from the sidelines in a jersey and shorts, as they ended up losing 21-14. Steele was expecting to be out 5 or 6 weeks, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. Sadly though, he came back and then hurt his ankle, and his junior season was a wash. This absolutely killed his recruiting stock, as in case you don't know, the junior year is the main time for getting college offers. Initially, he wanted to play college football in the SEC, as LSU and Kentucky actually had their eyes on him. But a series of setbacks in high school derailed all those hopes. As I said, he had that hamstring, and then he had that ankle problem. Scouts and other teams were kind of worried about this, and he slipped through the cracks. Luckily, he would bounce back though, as he ended up running for 1,600 yards and 31 touchdowns as a senior, and led Center Grove to a 14-0 record in a Class 6A state championship. That season, he ended up winning Mr. Football and was a 6A state champion, and the mark he left on Center Grove was a deep one. He became the most decorated player in Center Grove's 65 years of football, which is a huge deal. Head coach Eric Moore said, quote, "I don't know if there's any player since I've been here that stepped on the field as a freshman and dominated like he has statistically. He's been a highly decorated kid." His senior season was disrupted by the pandemic, and that limited his recruiting opportunities even more than his injuries. He ended up picking up scholarship offers from Ball State, Indiana State, Illinois State, Southern Illinois, and Western Illinois, and those aren't the biggest offers in the world. When it came down to making a decision, Carson Steele had two choices: accept a full ride at Ball State or become a preferred walk-on at Purdue. Ultimately, he decided to pick Ball State because the coaches had remained loyal to him and he could get his school paid for. They always expressed interest in him and were always checking in with him during the injury stuff. Steele said, quote, "Ball State kept with me. They offered me a year ago and stayed with me through the injuries and kept talking with me and telling me that they trusted me and believe in me. That showed me they are in it no matter what happens, and that was a big factor." Steele said Indiana talked to him about being a linebacker and they also wanted to try him out at running back, but ultimately those were just preferred walk-on offers. He sensed more of an opportunity to play at Ball State right away and chose to go there. According to 24/7 Sports, Steele was a 2-star recruit and the 287th best running back in the class of 2021. In total, he was extremely highly decorated as he finished with 5,907 career yards, 82 touchdowns, won a state championship, and was the first Mr. Football in Center Grove history. So, how'd he end up doing a few hours north in Muncie, Indiana? Well, let's take a look. While Carson Steele was obviously a huge name, his teammates weren't exactly sold on him. There were 48 players on Ball State's roster who constantly heard about Steele, and one fifth-year senior said, quote, "We was like, okay, we'll have to wait and see what happens when he gets on the practice field." Basically, they were saying they didn't think he was as good as advertised, but apparently early in fall camp, head coach Mike New and all those players knew that Steele was going to be a member of Ball State's running back committee right away, and it started when he saw him in the weight room and how hard he practiced. Eventually, on his third collegiate carry, he went past a couple of Western Illinois defenders and would have a 37-yard touchdown. Honestly, not too many people were that surprised. He made his impact felt during his first game as he ran for a total of 79 yards and had his first touchdown, as I said. Center Grove head coach said, quote, "That's just Carson being Carson." In total, as a freshman, Steele would run the ball 177 times for 829 yards and 6 total touchdowns. Going into 2022, Steele would have an even bigger season, and he was starting to get a little bit of hype. In Steele's first game, he'd play on the road against Tennessee, and while he was limited, he would bounce back as he had 137 yards and a touchdown against Western Michigan, and then 141 yards and a touchdown against Murray State. He'd continue on strong for the remainder of the season, as he'd only have 3 total games with less than 100 yards, and would have 100 yards in 6 of his last 7 games, including 179 yards and 3 touchdowns in a win over UConn, 198 yards and 3 touchdowns in a loss to Toledo, and then 180 yards and 2 touchdowns in a loss to Miami of Ohio. Ultimately, they would end up missing out on a bowl game, and Carson Steele would finish his season with 1,556 yards and 14 touchdowns. He was a huge deal and became one of the better running backs in the MAC as he actually led the MAC conference. Steele's production ended up leading him to UCLA, where he eventually would replace running back Zach Charbonnet, who had left for the 2023 NFL Draft. He admitted that head coach Chip Kelly was definitely testing him a bit with the new offense, and he was going to be a 1-2 punch with TJ Harden for that starting running back job. So how did Steele end up doing with UCLA? In his first game against Coastal Carolina, he'd run for 76 yards, and then had 84 yards and his first touchdown in a Bruins uniform in a road victory over San Diego State. He then had another touchdown against NC Central, before he struggled in a loss to Utah. After that, he'd have his best 3-game stretch of the season, in which he'd go for 141 yards in a win over number 13 Washington State, 110 yards and a touchdown against number 15 Oregon State, and then 3 touchdowns in a road victory over Stanford. That was the peak of Steele's season, as after that he did end up falling off. In his last 5 games, he failed to get over 75 yards and did not score a single touchdown on the ground. He would in fact catch a touchdown through the air against Colorado, but in total, Steele would finish with 847 yards and 6 total touchdowns. This was a pretty big deal for him, and he went from averaging in the high 90s yards per carry to then ending up dropping to about 49.5. That was a little bit disappointing, but he still decided to declare for the 2024 NFL Draft and thank Coach New and head coach Chip Kelly. Steele was seen as a late-round prospect at best, as he didn't exactly check all the boxes that a modern NFL team is looking for in a running back, but he had a few tricks up his sleeve. He ended up going undrafted, but the Super Bowl champions decided to take a risk on him, and he would give the fan base plenty of reasons to celebrate. Steele ended up having a tremendous preseason and had his best highlight reel level play on August 22nd, as he broke seemingly 15 tackles on his way to a touchdown. From that point on, he appeared to be a lock to make the active roster, but again, nothing was guaranteed with the Chiefs. He was also playing a little bit of fullback, so Steele had multiple uses. He could play running back and play fullback, and that is why he was not as expendable. He ended up finishing the preseason with 11 carries for 87 yards and 2 touchdowns, with 6 first downs along the way. He averaged nearly 8 yards per carry, and he had 3 runs that went for over 10 plus yards. More importantly, he showed that he had versatility, as he also returned kicks and even made some tackles. Eventually, he would secure his spot on the 53-man roster, and he will get his wish to become the Chiefs' Swiss Army knife this season. Honestly, Carson Steele is one of the best stories, and I can't wait to watch him in a couple nights against the Ravens. This is a guy who I watched when I was leaving high school, and I always knew he was one day going to make it big in college football, but I had no idea he would make it to being this big for the Chiefs. Maybe he'll flame out and get cut after a week, but I don't really think so. He seems like the kind of glue guy that Andy Reid will want for the Chiefs, and he seems like a guy who's going to have a long career in the NFL because of how hard he works and how physical he is. I'm glad I got to tell the story, but what do you guys think? If you're a Chiefs fan, what do you think of Carson Steele, and what other players should I cover next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.